Sarah Martinez adjusted her worn leather jacket as she walked through the busy terminal of Denver International Airport. At 42, she carried herself with quiet confidence, though her appearance drew little attention from the rushing crowds. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her clothes were practical rather than fashionable. She had learned long ago that blending in often served her better than standing out. The flight to San Francisco was delayed by an hour, giving her time to grab a coffee and find her gate. Sarah settled into an uncomfortable airport chair and pulled out a dog-eared paperback novel. She had been looking forward to this trip for months. Her younger sister was getting married, and Sarah had promised to be there despite her busy schedule. It would be the first time in 3 years that the entire family would be together. When boarding finally began, Sarah made her way down the narrow aisle of the commercial airliner. Her seat was in the middle section, sandwiched between a businessman typing furiously on his laptop and a well-dressed woman who immediately looked her up and down with obvious disdain. Sarah had encountered this reaction countless times before. People often made assumptions based on appearances, and she had learned to ignore the judgment in their eyes. As she stowed her small carry-on bag in the overhead compartment, the woman beside her whispered loudly to her companion across the aisle, "I can't believe they let just anyone fly these days. Look at her clothes. Probably can't even afford a proper meal." Her voice carried further than she intended, causing several passengers in nearby rows to turn and stare. Sarah felt the familiar heat of embarrassment creep up her neck, but she kept her expression neutral and took her seat without responding. The businessman next to her chuckled softly and shook his head. "Some people really don't know their place anymore," he muttered just loud enough for Sarah to hear. She opened her book and tried to focus on the words, but the hostile atmosphere around her made concentration difficult. More passengers were boarding now, and she could feel their eyes on her as they passed by her row. A teenage girl a few seats back pointed in Sarah's direction and whispered something to her mother, causing both of them to laugh. The sound cut through Sarah like a knife, bringing back memories of similar moments from her childhood when kids would mock her second-hand clothes and quiet demeanor. She had thought those days were behind her, but apparently, some things never changed. As the plane filled up, the comments continued. "I wonder if she even has a job," someone said. "Probably flying on someone else's dime," added another voice. Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath, reminding herself that their opinions didn't matter. She had faced much worse criticism in her professional life and had learned to develop thick skin. But something about being trapped in a metal tube at 30,000 feet with nowhere to escape made the situation feel more intense than usual. The flight attendant began the safety demonstration, but Sarah noticed that even she seemed to glance in her direction with a slight frown. It was as if her very presence on the plane was somehow offensive to everyone around her. She wondered if she should have dressed differently for the trip, maybe worn something more expensive looking. But then she reminded herself that she had never been one to put on airs or pretend to be something she wasn't. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Sarah gripped the armrests and stared out the small window beside her. The businessman had claimed the aisle seat and was now engaged in a loud phone conversation about some important business deal, making sure everyone within earshot knew how successful he was. The contrast between his confident boasting and the whispered insults directed at her was not lost on Sarah. The engines roared to life, and the aircraft began to taxi toward the runway. Sarah felt the familiar mixture of excitement and nervousness that always accompanied takeoff. Despite having flown countless times, she still found the experience both thrilling and slightly terrifying. As they gained speed and lifted off the ground, she watched the city shrink below them and tried to push aside the negative energy surrounding her seat. Once they reached cruising altitude, the captain's voice came over the intercom with the usual announcements about flight time and weather conditions. Sarah settled back in her seat and opened her book again, determined to make the best of the 3-hour flight despite the unwelcoming atmosphere. She had learned long ago that the best response to ignorance was often simply to rise above it with dignity and grace. 20 minutes into the flight, the comments from nearby passengers had not subsided. If anything, they seemed to be growing bolder. The well-dressed woman in the seat beside Sarah had struck up a conversation with several other passengers, and their topic of discussion was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. "I just don't understand how airlines don't screen passengers better these days," the woman was saying, her voice deliberately loud. When I was younger, flying was elegant. People dressed appropriately and showed respect for their fellow travelers. She gestured dismissively in Sarah's direction, without looking directly at her. Now they just let anyone on board, regardless of whether they belong in civilized company. A man from across the aisle leaned forward to join the conversation. He was wearing an expensive suit and a gold watch that caught the overhead lights. "You're absolutely right, Patricia. Standards have really declined. I mean, look around this plane. Half these people probably saved up their grocery money just to afford a ticket." His eyes swept over Sarah, with obvious contempt. "Some of them clearly can't even afford decent clothing." Sarah kept her eyes fixed on her book, but the words on the page had become meaningless. She could feel her face burning with humiliation, and her hands were trembling slightly as she turned a page. The rational part of her mind knew that these people's opinions meant nothing, but the emotional impact of their cruel words was harder to dismiss. A younger woman sitting 2 rows back decided to add her voice to the chorus. "My husband and I were just talking about this last week," she announced. "Airlines should really consider having different sections for different types of passengers. Keep the riffraff separate from people who actually contribute to society." Her comment drew nods and murmurs of agreement from several other passengers. The businessman next to Sarah closed his laptop with a sharp snap and turned to face the growing group of critics. "I couldn't agree more," he said with authority. "I run a successful consulting firm, and I can tell you that appearances matter. When someone can't even be bothered to dress presentably for a flight, it says something about their character and work ethic." He glanced pointedly at Sarah's simple clothing. "Some people just don't understand basic social expectations." Sarah's chest tightened as she listened to the increasingly personal attacks. She had dealt with workplace discrimination and social prejudice throughout her career, but this felt different somehow. These strangers were making assumptions about her worth as a human being based solely on her appearance, and they were doing it loud enough for half the plane to hear. A flight attendant passed by their section, and Patricia flagged her down with an imperious wave. "Excuse me, miss," she said in a tone that suggested she was used to being obeyed. "Is there any way you could help us with a seating situation? Some of us paid good money for these tickets, and we're finding the atmosphere in this section rather unpleasant." She didn't need to specify what she meant. Her meaning was crystal clear. The flight attendant looked uncomfortable and glanced nervously at Sarah before responding. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the flight is completely full today. I'm afraid there aren't any available seats for relocations." She hurried away before Patricia could press the issue further, clearly wanting to avoid getting involved in the escalating situation. This response only seemed to fuel the group's indignation. "Unbelievable," muttered the man in the expensive suit. "We're basically trapped here with people who have no business flying in the first place." He looked around the cabin as if seeking support from other passengers. "I bet she's flying on some kind of charity program or government assistance. Probably never worked a real day in her life." The teenage girl from earlier had been listening intently to the adult conversation, and now she felt emboldened to contribute her own observations. "Maybe she's homeless or something," she suggested in a stage whisper that carried clearly through the cabin. "That would explain the clothes and why she looks so out of place here." Her comment drew chuckles from several passengers and an approving nod from her mother. Sarah finally looked up from her book, her eyes sweeping across the faces of her tormentors. She saw no sympathy there, only judgment and superiority. These people had decided within minutes of seeing her that she was somehow less worthy of respect than they were. The businessman was already turning back to his laptop, apparently satisfied that he had made his point about social hierarchies and proper behavior. As the plane continued its journey through the clear afternoon sky, Sarah found herself thinking about all the times she had been underestimated or dismissed because of her appearance. She had learned to expect it in certain situations, but she had hoped that air travel might be different. Unfortunately, 30,000 feet above the ground seemed to bring out the worst in some people's character, and she was bearing the brunt of their ugly attitudes. As the flight progressed, the hostile atmosphere around Sarah seemed to intensify rather than fade. More passengers had begun to take notice of the situation, and unfortunately most of them seemed to be siding with her critics. The well-dressed woman named Patricia had appointed herself as the unofficial spokesperson for the group, and she was clearly enjoying her role as the defender of proper social standards. "I've been flying first class for over 20 years," Patricia announced to anyone who would listen, "and I've never seen such a decline in passenger quality. Airlines used to have standards. They used to care about maintaining a certain level of sophistication." She shot another disapproving look in Sarah's direction. "Now they'll sell a ticket to anyone with enough coins scraped together from their couch cushions." The man in the expensive suit had reopened his laptop, but continued to participate in the conversation. "It's a reflection of society in general," he proclaimed with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his opinions valued. "People have lost all sense of pride in their appearance and behavior. They think they're entitled to the same treatment as those of us who've actually earned our place in the world through hard work and success." Sarah tried to focus on her book, but the words kept swimming before her eyes. The story she was reading involved a woman overcoming obstacles to achieve her dreams, which felt ironically appropriate, given her current situation. She wondered what these passengers would think if they knew anything about her actual background or accomplishments. But then again, she had learned long ago that some people were so invested in their prejudices that facts rarely changed their minds. A flight attendant approached with the beverage cart, and Sarah requested a simple coffee. As the attendant handed her the cup, Patricia made another loud observation. "I notice she's not ordering anything alcoholic. Probably can't afford it, or maybe she's one of those people who can't handle their liquor." The comment drew snickers from nearby passengers, and Sarah felt her face flush with renewed embarrassment. The teenage girl from a few rows back had moved closer to get a better view of the situation. She was now standing in the aisle, pretending to stretch while obviously listening to every word. "My dad says you can always tell someone's social class by how they dress and act in public," she announced proudly, as if sharing profound wisdom. "He says poor people don't know how to behave around their betters." The businessman nodded approvingly at this comment. "Your father is a smart man. It's important for young people to understand these social realities early in life." He gestured toward Sarah without looking at her directly. "Some people never learn their place in society, so they end up making everyone around them uncomfortable with their inappropriate presence." Sarah set down her coffee cup carefully, her hands steady despite the emotional turmoil churning inside her. She had faced discrimination in many forms throughout her life, but this public humiliation felt particularly cruel. These strangers had created an elaborate narrative about her life and character based on nothing more than her modest appearance, and they were clearly enjoying the opportunity to feel superior at her expense. An older gentleman sitting across the aisle had been quietly observing the situation, and he finally decided to speak up. However, instead of defending Sarah, he added his voice to the chorus of criticism. "In my day, people knew how to dress for air travel," he said with the authority of someone who had lived through supposedly better times. "Men wore suits and ties, women wore dresses and proper shoes. Everyone understood that flying was a privilege, not a right." Patricia seized on this support eagerly. "Exactly. Flying used to be special, an event worth dressing up for. Now look around this cabin. Half the passengers look like they just rolled out of bed or came straight from doing yard work." Her voice carried clearly throughout the section, ensuring that Sarah and everyone else could hear every word of her disdain. The conversation had attracted the attention of passengers in other rows, and some of them were craning their necks to get a better look at the woman who had sparked such controversy. Sarah could feel their eyes on her like physical weights, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She wanted nothing more than to disappear or find some way to escape the increasingly hostile environment. A middle-aged woman from several rows forward had turned around completely in her seat to join the discussion. "I was just telling my husband that standards everywhere are declining," she contributed. "Whether it's restaurants, theaters, or airplanes, people just don't respect shared spaces anymore. They think they can show up anywhere looking like slobs and expect to be treated with the same courtesy as people who make an effort." The flight attendant passed by again, and Sarah noticed that she seemed to be avoiding eye contact. It was clear that the crew was aware of the situation but had decided not to intervene, perhaps hoping that the problem would resolve itself. Sarah couldn't blame them entirely. Dealing with passenger conflicts was probably not the most pleasant part of their job, especially when multiple people were involved. The turbulence started without warning. What began as minor bumps quickly escalated into violent shaking that sent loose items flying through the cabin. Coffee cups clattered to the floor, overhead bins rattled ominously, and passengers gripped their armrests with white knuckles. The airplane pitched and rolled unpredictably, as if caught in an invisible storm that threatened to tear it apart. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the aircraft suddenly plummeted several hundred feet before catching itself with a sickening lurch. Around her, the same passengers who had been so confident in their superiority just minutes before were now pale-faced and terrified. Patricia, who had been holding court with her social commentary, was now clutching her seat and breathing rapidly through obvious panic. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, but his usually calm tone carried an edge of concern that made everyone's anxiety spike higher. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some severe turbulence due to unexpected weather conditions. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened and follow all crew instructions. Immediately. The formal announcement did little to calm the growing sense of panic spreading through the cabin. The businessman next to Sarah had gone completely rigid, his expensive laptop forgotten on his lap as he stared straight ahead with wide, frightened eyes. His earlier confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced by the same primal fear that was affecting everyone on board. The airplane continued to buck and shake like an angry beast, and even the flight attendants looked worried as they struggled to maintain their balance while checking on passengers. A child somewhere in the cabin began crying loudly, which seemed to trigger a wave of barely controlled hysteria among several adult passengers. The teenage girl who had been so eager to mock Sarah earlier was now sobbing openly, her bravado completely forgotten in the face of genuine danger. Her mother was trying to comfort her while fighting back her own obvious terror. The turbulence grew even more violent, and suddenly the oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments with a mechanical thunk that sent several passengers into full panic mode. Sarah automatically reached for her mask and began putting it on, her movements calm and practiced even as chaos erupted around her. She had been through emergency procedures many times before, though the other passengers had no way of knowing that. Patricia was hyperventilating now, her face flushed red as she struggled with her oxygen mask. "I can't breathe," she gasped, her voice high and desperate. "Something's wrong with my mask. I can't get it to work properly." Her hands were shaking so badly that she couldn't manage to secure the elastic straps, and her panic was making the situation worse. Without hesitation, Sarah leaned over and gently took the mask from Patricia's trembling hands. "Breathe slowly," she said in a calm, authoritative voice that cut through the chaos. "The mask is fine. You're just panicking, which makes it feel like you can't get enough air." She adjusted the straps and positioned the mask correctly over Patricia's nose and mouth. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. Count with me. 1, 2, 3. The businessman was struggling with his own mask, his earlier arrogance replaced by fumbling incompetence. Sarah noticed his distress and reached across to help him as well, her movements efficient and confident. "Pull the elastic over your head first, then adjust the fit," she instructed. "The oxygen is flowing properly. You just need to relax and let it work." All around them, passengers were in various states of panic and confusion. The airplane continued to shake violently, and several people were crying or praying loudly. The flight attendants were doing their best to assist everyone, but they were outnumbered and clearly stretched thin. Sarah found herself naturally taking charge of her immediate area, helping passenger after passenger with their oxygen masks and providing calm reassurance. "Are we going to crash?" the teenage girl called out through her tears, voicing the question that everyone was thinking but afraid to ask. Her mother had no answer, too overwhelmed by her own fear to provide the comfort her daughter desperately needed. Sarah turned toward the girl with the same steady composure she had shown throughout the crisis. "The aircraft is handling the turbulence exactly as it's designed to do," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the cabin. "These planes are built to withstand much worse than this. The pilots are highly trained professionals who know exactly how to get us through this safely." Her words seemed to have a calming effect on several nearby passengers, who began to look to her for guidance and reassurance. The older gentleman who had criticized her appearance earlier was now staring at her with obvious confusion, as if trying to reconcile this competent, commanding presence with his earlier assumptions about her character and background. The airplane hit another severe pocket of turbulence, throwing everyone forward in their seats. Several passengers screamed, but Sarah remained perfectly calm, continuing to monitor the people around her and offer assistance wherever needed. She checked on an elderly woman across the aisle who appeared to be having trouble with her breathing, quickly assessing her condition and providing gentle encouragement. The turbulence reached a crescendo that had even the most experienced travelers genuinely frightened. The aircraft was shaking so violently that it seemed impossible for it to hold together. Luggage had broken free from overhead compartments and personal items were scattered throughout the cabin. The lights flickered ominously, and the sound of straining metal filled the air with an unsettling symphony of mechanical stress. In the midst of this chaos, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The flight attendant nearest to their section had gone completely white and was gripping the back of a seat so tightly that her knuckles were bone white. More alarming was the fact that she kept glancing toward the cockpit with an expression of genuine terror that went far beyond normal turbulence concerns. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, and this time there was no mistaking the gravity in his tone. "Flight attendants, please prepare for possible emergency procedures. Passengers, remain calm and follow all crew instructions. We are dealing with a serious mechanical situation in addition to the severe weather conditions." The word mechanical sent a new wave of panic through the cabin. Patricia, who had been somewhat calmed by Sarah's earlier assistance, immediately began hyperventilating again. "We're going to die," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with absolute conviction. "Something's wrong with the plane. We're all gonna die up here." The businessman had gone completely silent, his face gray with terror as he stared at the emergency instruction card in his hands, as if it might contain some magical solution to their predicament. Around them, other passengers were beginning to realize that this was no ordinary turbulence situation. The crew's behavior was too tense, too focused for this to be routine. A flight attendant struggled down the aisle, fighting against the aircraft's violent movements to reach the intercom system. Her voice was professional but strained as she began speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to our current situation, we need to identify any passengers with relevant emergency experience. If you have military training, medical training, or aviation experience, please make yourself known to the crew immediately." Sarah felt her heart begin to race, but not from fear. After years of keeping her background private, she was facing a moment when her skills might literally mean the difference between life and death for everyone on board. She could see the flight attendant scanning the cabin desperately, looking for anyone who might be able to help in whatever crisis they were facing. The airplane suddenly dropped again, this time so severely that several passengers screamed in terror. Emergency lights began flashing throughout the cabin, and the sound of alarms could be heard coming from the cockpit area. The flight attendant, who had been looking for volunteers, was thrown against the side of the aircraft, hitting her head hard enough to leave her dazed and disoriented. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her movements steady and purposeful despite the violent motion of the airplane. "I have relevant experience," she called out loudly enough for the crew to hear. The flight attendant looked at her with obvious skepticism, taking in her plain appearance and modest clothing with doubt clearly written across her face. "What kind of experience?" the attendant asked, having to shout over the noise of the struggling aircraft and the panicked voices of passengers. Her tone suggested that she was hoping for a doctor, or perhaps someone with basic first aid training, not expecting anything that would actually help with their current predicament. Before Sarah could answer, the captain's voice filled the cabin again, and this time his words sent chills through everyone present. "This is Captain Rodriguez. We are experiencing multiple system failures and need immediate assistance. Is there a fighter pilot on board this aircraft? If so, please identify yourself to the crew right away. This is an emergency situation." The cabin fell into stunned silence except for the mechanical sounds of the aircraft's distress. A fighter pilot. The captain was asking for a fighter pilot. Several passengers looked around at each other with expressions of hopeless despair, as if the request was so specific and unlikely that it confirmed their worst fears about their chances of survival. Patricia stared at Sarah with wide, terrified eyes. "A fighter pilot," she repeated in a whisper. "Where are we supposed to find a fighter pilot on a commercial flight? We're all going to die because there's nobody here who can help us." Her voice broke on the last words, and she buried her face in her hands. The businessman looked around the cabin wildly, as if a military pilot might suddenly materialize from among the collection of ordinary travelers. "This is impossible," he said to no one in particular. "What are the odds that there would be a fighter pilot on this specific flight at this specific moment?" "We're finished." Sarah took a deep breath and stepped into the aisle, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin despite the chaos around them. "I'm here," she said simply. I'm a fighter pilot. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, competing with the sound of alarms and mechanical stress for the attention of everyone present. The flight attendant stared at her in complete shock, her gaze moving from Sarah's unremarkable appearance to her calm, confident demeanor. Around them, the passengers who had spent the flight mocking and belittling Sarah were now looking at her with expressions of disbelief and dawning realization of just how wrong their assumptions had been. The silence that followed Sarah's declaration lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity to everyone in the cabin. Then the flight attendant sprang into action with renewed energy, her professional training overriding her shock at Sarah's unexpected revelation. "Please come with me immediately," she said, her voice urgent but respectful in a way that was completely different from how she had treated Sarah earlier. As Sarah moved toward the cockpit, she could feel every eye in the cabin following her progress. The same passengers who had spent the flight dismissing her as unworthy of their respect were now watching her with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Patricia's mouth was hanging open in shock while the businessman looked like he had seen a ghost. "Wait," Patricia called out weakly, her voice barely audible over the aircraft's distress. "She can't really be a pilot. Look at her. She doesn't look like any pilot I've ever seen." But her protest sounded hollow now, desperate attempts to reconcile her prejudices with the reality unfolding before her eyes. The teenage girl who had mocked Sarah earlier was staring with wide eyes. "Mom, is she really a fighter pilot?" she whispered to her mother, who had no answer to give. The concept that the woman they had all been ridiculing might actually be their salvation was too jarring for most of them to immediately accept. Sarah reached the cockpit area and was immediately ushered inside by the flight crew. The scene that greeted her confirmed her worst fears about their situation. Captain Rodriguez was fighting with controls that were barely responding, while his co-pilot worked frantically through emergency checklists. Warning lights covered the instrument panel like a deadly Christmas display, and the sound of alarms filled the small space. "Thank God you're here," Captain Rodriguez said without looking away from his instruments. "I'm Captain Rodriguez, and this is First Officer Chen. We've lost hydraulic systems, our flight controls are severely compromised, and we're fighting multiple engine problems. I need someone with advanced flight experience to help us troubleshoot options I might not be seeing." Sarah quickly assessed the situation, her trained eyes taking in the instrument readings and system failures with the expertise that came from years of flying high-performance military aircraft. "What's your current status on backup systems?" she asked, her voice calm and professional as she studied the chaotic display of warning indicators. "Backup hydraulics are at 30% and dropping," First Officer Chen reported. "We've got engine number 2 showing signs of failure, and our primary flight computer is giving us conflicting data. We're basically flying on manual control with degraded response across all surfaces." The aircraft lurched violently to one side, and Sarah could hear renewed screams from the passenger cabin. She braced herself against the cockpit wall and continued her assessment. "Have you tried cycling the backup power to reset the flight computer? Sometimes you can clear phantom errors that way." Captain Rodriguez looked at her with surprise and respect. "I was just about to try that. You really do know what you're talking about." He began the power cycling procedure while Sarah monitored the other systems for any signs of improvement or further deterioration. Back in the passenger cabin, word had spread quickly that the unremarkable woman in the simple clothes was actually a military pilot who might be able to save their lives. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically from panic to desperate hope, with many passengers now looking toward the cockpit area as if Sarah had become their personal guardian angel. "I can't believe it," the businessman muttered, shaking his head repeatedly. "I was sitting right next to a fighter pilot this whole time, and I treated her like she was nobody special." His expensive suit and gold watch suddenly seemed trivial compared to the life-or-death expertise that Sarah was providing in the cockpit. The older gentleman, who had lectured about proper dress codes, was now staring at his hands in shame. "We were all so wrong about her," he said quietly to anyone who would listen. "We judged her completely based on her appearance, and now she's the only reason we might make it home to our families." In the cockpit, Sarah was working with both pilots to develop a strategy for bringing the damaged aircraft safely to the ground. Her experience with high-stress emergency situations and her knowledge of advanced flight systems were proving invaluable. She had flown through combat situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death, and that training was serving her well now. "Try reducing power to engine 1 while we work on the hydraulic bypass," she suggested, her fingers pointing to specific controls as she spoke. "If we can get even partial control authority back, we might be able to set up for an emergency landing." Her voice carried the confidence of someone who had faced impossible odds before and emerged victorious. Captain Rodriguez followed her recommendations, and gradually they began to see small improvements in the aircraft's response to their inputs. It was still far from normal flight conditions, but Sarah's expertise was helping them find solutions that neither of the commercial pilots would have considered on their own. "There," Sarah said as one of the warning lights finally went out. "We've got partial hydraulics back. It's not much, but it should give us enough control authority to attempt a landing if we can find a suitable airport." She was already thinking ahead to the approach and landing phase, calculating the reduced capabilities they would have and the techniques needed to compensate. The relief in Captain Rodriguez's voice was obvious as he keyed the radio to contact air traffic control. "Denver Center, this is Flight 447. We have a qualified military pilot assisting us, and we're showing some improvement in our emergency situation. Request immediate clearance to the nearest suitable airport for emergency landing." Meanwhile, in the passenger cabin, the mood had shifted from despair to cautious optimism. The aircraft was still experiencing problems, but the violent shaking had decreased somewhat, and passengers could sense that something positive was happening in the cockpit. Patricia was no longer hyperventilating, though she kept staring toward the front of the plane with an expression of amazement and guilt. "She's really doing it," someone whispered. "That woman is actually helping to save us." The statement hung in the air like a rebuke to everyone who had participated in the earlier mockery. The same people who had questioned Sarah's right to be on the airplane were now depending on her expertise to survive the flight. 2 hours later, Flight 447 touched down safely at Denver International Airport in what aviation experts would later describe as a textbook emergency landing under impossible conditions. Fire trucks and ambulances lined the runway, but thanks to Sarah's expertise and the skill of the flight crew, they wouldn't be needed for anything more than precautionary measures. As the aircraft came to a complete stop and the engines finally wound down, the cabin erupted in spontaneous applause and cheers. Passengers were crying with relief, hugging strangers and expressing gratitude for being alive. Through it all, Sarah made her way quietly back to her seat, hoping to avoid any unnecessary attention or drama. But the passengers weren't about to let her slip away unnoticed. Patricia was the first to approach her, tears streaming down her face as she struggled to find adequate words. "I am so incredibly sorry," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I said terrible things about you, made horrible assumptions, and you saved our lives anyway. I don't know how to apologize for being such an awful person." The businessman stood up as well, his expensive suit now wrinkled, and his earlier arrogance completely gone. "Ma'am, I owe you the biggest apology of my life," he said formally. "I judged you based on your appearance and treated you with complete disrespect. You had every right to let us face this crisis alone after the way we behaved, but you chose to help us anyway. That shows a character that I clearly lack." One by one, the other passengers who had participated in the mockery came forward to offer their apologies and express their gratitude. The teenage girl was sobbing as she approached Sarah. "I'm sorry for being so mean," she whispered. "I learned something really important today about not judging people. You're a hero, and I was just being cruel for no reason." Sarah accepted each apology with grace and dignity, though she could see that her fellow passengers were struggling with the magnitude of their misjudgment. "We all make assumptions sometimes," she said gently. "What matters is that we learn from our mistakes and treat people better in the future." As the passengers prepared to disembark, Captain Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit to address the cabin personally. His face was solemn as he spoke into the intercom system. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that what happened today was one of the most serious in-flight emergencies I've encountered in 25 years of flying. Without the assistance of Major Sarah Martinez, a decorated Air Force fighter pilot, I'm not certain we would have been able to bring this aircraft down safely." The revelation of Sarah's military rank and decorated service record sent another wave of shock through the passengers. Major Martinez. Not only was she a fighter pilot, but she was a high-ranking officer with a distinguished service record. The contrast between their treatment of her and her actual status was so stark that several passengers looked physically ill with embarrassment. Captain Rodriguez continued his announcement. Major Martinez flew combat missions in 3 different theaters of operation and has over 15 years of experience in high-performance military aircraft. Her expertise and calm leadership in our cockpit today saved every life on this airplane. I wanted you all to know exactly who was sitting among you. After the aircraft was fully evacuated and the passengers had been processed through the terminal, Sarah finally had a moment to herself. She was sitting in a quiet corner of the airport, waiting for a rescheduled flight to San Francisco, when Patricia approached her one final time. "I keep thinking about what you said," Patricia began hesitantly, "about how we all make assumptions and need to learn from our mistakes. I realize now that I've probably done this to other people throughout my life, and I never stopped to consider how much damage my prejudices might cause." She paused, looking genuinely remorseful. "I want to be better than that. I want to teach my children to be better than that." Sarah looked up from her book and smiled warmly. "That's all any of us can do. Recognize our faults and work to improve ourselves." Today was a learning experience for everyone involved. As Patricia walked away, Sarah reflected on the day's events. She had faced discrimination and mockery with dignity, used her skills to help save lives, and hopefully taught some valuable lessons about the danger of judging others based on appearances. Sometimes the most important battles weren't fought in the skies over foreign countries, but right here at home in the everyday interactions between people who had forgotten how to see past surface differences to the human worth underneath. When her replacement flight was called for boarding, Sarah gathered her simple carry-on bag and walked toward the gate. This time she noticed the other passengers treated her with respectful nods and genuine smiles. Word had spread through the terminal about the quiet hero who had helped save Flight 447, and her fellow travelers had learned something valuable about looking beyond first impressions. As she settled into her seat for the continuation of her journey, Sarah allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. Sometimes the most important victories came not from defeating an enemy, but from helping others defeat their own prejudices and become better versions of themselves.